The sound of Emma Rodriguez hitting the gymnasium floor echoed through the empty corridors like a gunshot. Blood trickled from her split lip as she struggled to push herself up from the cold concrete. Her algebra textbook scattered in torn pages around her trembling form. Tyler Brooks stood over her, his letterman jacket pristine despite what he'd just done. A cruel smirk twisting his features as he watched her fumble for her glasses that had been knocked clear across the floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maybe next time you'll think twice before telling Coach Stevens about our little study group arrangement, Tyler sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Behind him, 3 other football players formed a menacing wall, blocking any escape route Emma might have considered. The late afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow her whole as she finally managed to retrieve her cracked glasses and slide them onto her bruised face. Emma had always been different at Riverside High School. While other 16-year-olds were obsessing over social media and weekend parties, she spent her free time tutoring struggling students in mathematics and volunteering at the local animal shelter. Her father, Mark Rodriguez, taught advanced calculus in room 204, and she'd inherited both his analytical mind and his quiet determination. What she hadn't inherited was his ability to handle bullies, something that had been painfully obvious. For the past 3 months, the study group arrangement Tyler referenced was nothing more than academic extortion. He and his cronies had been forcing honor students to complete their assignments in exchange for protection from harassment. Emma had finally worked up the courage to report it to Coach Stevens yesterday, believing that surely an adult would intervene. Instead, she'd discovered that Stevens was more interested in keeping his star quarterback eligible for the upcoming regional championships than addressing what he dismissed as typical teenage drama. Now, as Tyler's shadow fell across her battered form, Emma realized her mistake had cost her more than just her dignity. Her left wrist throbbed with a pain that suggested something might be broken, and the metallic taste in her mouth told her that Tyler's final shove had done real damage. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to disappear entirely, but instead she forced herself to meet his gaze with the same steady resolve her father had taught her when solving impossible equations. "You think you're so smart because a daddy teaches here," Tyler continued, his voice growing more venomous with each word, "but you're just another nobody who needs to learn her place. Keep your mouth shut, or next time we won't be so gentle." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud as Tyler and his friends sauntered away, their laughter echoing off the gymnasium walls. Emma remained on the floor for several more minutes, not because she couldn't stand, but because she needed time to process what had just happened. The rational part of her mind, the part that had inherited her father's methodical approach to problem solving, was already cataloging the evidence. The witnesses who had quickly averted their eyes, the security camera in the corner that conveniently had a blind spot near where she'd fallen, and the growing realization that the school's administration might not be the sanctuary she'd always believed it to be. Emma finally pulled herself to her feet, wincing as her injured wrist protested the movement. The torn pages of her textbook lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, each one representing hours of careful note-taking and preparation that had been destroyed in moments. She began gathering them methodically, her mind already working through the implications of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about her anymore. Tyler's operation affected dozens of students who were too afraid to speak up. The hallways of Riverside High were nearly empty as Emma made her way toward the main office, her footsteps echoing in the silence that always settled over the school after the final bell. A few students lingered at their lockers, but most hurried past without making eye contact, The culture of fear that Tyler and his friends had cultivated was evident in every averted gaze and quickened pace. Emma understood now why her earlier attempt to seek help had fallen on deaf ears. The entire ecosystem of the school had been poisoned by intimidation. She paused outside the main office, her hand hovering over the door handle as doubt crept into her mind. What if Coach Stevens had already spoken to Principal Davis? What if the administration was more concerned about protecting the football program than protecting students? The thought made her stomach churn, but she pushed through the door anyway, driven by a determination that surprised even her. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, looked up from her computer with the practiced smile of someone who had dealt with countless teenage crises over the years. "Emma, honey, what happened to your face?" The concern in her voice was genuine, which gave Emma a small spark of hope that perhaps not every adult in the building had abandoned their responsibility to protect students. "I need to speak with Principal Davis," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's about Tyler Brooks and what's been happening with the football team." The change in Mrs. Henderson's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warmth in her eyes dimmed slightly, and her professional smile became more forced. "I'm afraid Principal Davis is in a meeting right now. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow, or better yet, maybe this is something you should discuss with your father first." The suggestion hit Emma like a physical blow. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had always been kind to her, was suggesting she handle this through unofficial channels rather than through the proper administrative procedures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The message was clear. The school's official position was to avoid dealing with anything that might threaten the football program's success. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that she was truly on her own in this fight. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I think I will talk to my father." As she turned to leave, Emma caught sight of her reflection in the glass door of the office. Her lip was swollen. There was a bruise forming along her left cheekbone, and her usually neat ponytail had come undone during the struggle. She looked like a victim, and that realization filled her with a cold fury that surprised her. She was Mark Rodriguez's daughter, and Rodriguez women didn't stay victims for long. The drive home gave Emma time to think about how she would approach the conversation with her father. Mark Rodriguez was not a man who dealt well with injustice, a trait that had served him well during his 2 tours as a Marine drill instructor, but sometimes made him seem intimidating to students and colleagues alike. Emma had inherited his analytical mind, but she'd also learned to appreciate his protective instincts, even when they sometimes felt overwhelming. Their house on Maple Street was a modest 2-story colonial that reflected her parents' practical approach to life. No unnecessary luxuries, but everything was well maintained and carefully organized. Her father's military background was evident in the precise way the lawn was edged and the systematic arrangement of tools in the garage. Emma had always found comfort in this order, but today it reminded her of the discipline and attention to detail that had made her father successful in environments where failure meant life or death. She found Mark in his home office, grading papers with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else in his life. Stacks of calculus exams were arranged in neat piles, each one marked with detailed feedback in his careful handwriting. When he looked up and saw her face, his pen stopped moving, and Emma watched as his expression shifted from mild curiosity to controlled fury in the space of a heartbeat. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, but Emma recognized the tone from stories he'd told about his military service. It was the voice of a man who was calculating the most efficient way to neutralize a threat. Emma settled into the chair across from his desk, her injured wrist cradled protectively against her chest. "Dad, I need to tell you about something that's been happening at school. It's not just about what happened to me today. There's a whole system of intimidation, and I think some of the faculty might be involved. Mark set down his pen and gave her his complete attention, the same focused concentration he brought to complex mathematical proofs. Emma had always admired her father's ability to listen without judgment, to gather all the facts before forming conclusions. She told him everything: the months of escalating harassment, the academic extortion scheme, her failed attempt to report it through proper channels, and finally, the assault in the gymnasium. As she spoke, Emma watched her father's jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists that spoke of years of military training. When she described Coach Stevens's dismissive response to her initial complaint, she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. Mark Rodriguez had spent years teaching young Marines how to survive in hostile environments, and he recognized the signs of institutional corruption when he saw them. "Show me your wrist," he said when she finished her account. His touch was gentle as he examined the injury, but Emma could feel the barely controlled tension in his movements. "We need to get this X-rayed. If it's broken, that's assault with bodily injury, regardless of what the school wants to call it." The trip to the emergency room confirmed what they both suspected. Emma's wrist was fractured in 2 places, requiring a cast that would serve as a visible reminder of Tyler's attack for the next 6 weeks. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, documented the injury with the thoroughness of someone who had seen too many cases of unreported violence. When Mark explained the circumstances, Dr. Martinez made it clear that he would be filing a mandatory report with both the police and Child Protective Services. "Mr. Rodriguez," Dr. Martinez said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to know that what happened to your daughter constitutes criminal assault. The fact that it occurred on school property makes the administration legally liable for providing a safe educational environment. You have options here, and I encourage you to explore all of them." During the drive home, Emma watched her father's reflection in the passenger window and realized that something fundamental had shifted. The gentle math teacher who helped struggling students work through difficult concepts had been replaced by the Marine who had once been responsible for preparing young soldiers for combat. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, evident in the way he held his shoulders and the calculated way he was processing information. "Dad, what are you thinking?" Emma asked, recognizing the distant look in his eyes that appeared when he was working through a particularly complex problem. Mark was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. "I'm thinking that Tyler Brooks and his friends have made a fundamental error in their calculations," he said finally. "They've operated under the assumption that they're untouchable because of their athletic status and administrative protection. What they've failed to consider is that their actions have consequences, and some of those consequences involve people who are trained to respond to threats." Emma felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. She had seen her father angry before, but this was different. This was the cold, methodical fury of someone who had been trained to handle hostile situations with precision and overwhelming force. Tyler Brooks had no idea what he had set in motion, but Emma was beginning to understand that her father's military training hadn't been forgotten, merely set aside while he focused on teaching young minds to appreciate the beauty of mathematics. As they pulled into their driveway, Emma noticed that her father was already making mental preparations for what was to come. His phone buzzed with a text message, and she saw him glance at the screen before a slight smile crossed his features. It wasn't a pleasant smile, and Emma realized that the network of support her father had built during his military service was still very much intact. "Emma?" he said as they sat in the darkened car, the porch light casting long shadows across his face. "Tomorrow we're going to solve this problem systematically, the way I taught you to approach complex equations. We'll identify all the variables, establish the parameters of the situation, and then apply the appropriate methodology to reach a solution. Emma nodded, understanding that her father was speaking in mathematical terms about what was essentially a declaration of war. Tyler Brooks and his enablers were about to discover that attacking the daughter of a former Marine drill instructor was a mistake that would have far-reaching and devastating consequences. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually filled Emma with anticipation for the day ahead. Today, however, she woke to the throbbing pain in her casted wrist and the purple bruises that had bloomed across her face overnight. The mirror in her bathroom told a story she wasn't ready to share with the world, but her father had made it clear that hiding the evidence would only enable Tyler's continued reign of terror. Mark Rodriguez had been awake since 0500 hours, habit ingrained by years of military discipline that civilian life had never quite erased. He'd spent the early morning hours making phone calls to contacts whose numbers he hadn't dialed in years, men and women who understood the meaning of loyalty and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. By the time Emma stumbled downstairs for breakfast, he had already initiated a chain of events that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics at Riverside High School. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Linda Rodriguez asked as Emma carefully maneuvered her casted arm while trying to pour orange juice. Emma's mother worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, and her clinical eye immediately assessed the extent of her daughter's injuries with professional concern and maternal fury. "Better than Tyler's going to feel when Dad gets through with him," Emma replied, surprised by the venom in her own voice. The timid girl who had been content to help struggling students with their homework had been replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice required more than proper channels and administrative procedures. Mark looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing the student handbook and district policies with the thoroughness of someone planning a military operation. "Emma, I want you to understand something important. What we're about to do isn't about revenge. It's about establishing clear consequences for actions and ensuring that no other student has to endure what you experienced yesterday." The drive to school was unusually quiet, with Emma processing the weight of what lay ahead, while Mark mentally rehearsed the conversations he would be having with various members of the school administration. His military training had taught him the importance of preparation and the value of understanding your opponent's capabilities before engaging in any confrontation. Tyler Brooks and his enablers were about to discover that they had severely underestimated the capabilities of their newest adversary. Riverside High School buzzed with its usual morning energy as students gathered in clusters around lockers and in the hallways. But Emma noticed something different in the way people looked at her. Word of yesterday's incident had spread through the social networks that connected every teenager in Millbrook, and she could feel the mixture of sympathy and fear that her appearance generated. Some students offered hesitant smiles of support, while others quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to risk becoming Tyler's next target. Jessica Chen was waiting by Emma's locker, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by an expression of barely contained outrage. Jessica had been Emma's closest friend since middle school, and seeing her friend's battered face filled her with a protective fury that matched Mark Rodriguez's military precision. Unlike Emma, Jessica had no qualms about confronting bullies directly, a trait that had occasionally gotten her into trouble but had also earned her respect among their classmates. "Oh my God, Emma, your face," Jessica whispered, her hands hovering, uncertainly, as if she wanted to hug her friend but was afraid of causing additional pain. "I heard what happened from Ryan Mitchell. He saw Tyler and his cronies leaving the gymnasium yesterday, and when he went to check, he found your torn textbook, pages scattered everywhere. Ryan Mitchell was another piece of the puzzle that Emma was beginning to understand. A quiet sophomore who excelled in computer science, Ryan had been one of Tyler's earlier victims, forced to complete programming assignments for the football team's academic eligibility. Unlike Emma, Ryan had never attempted to report the extortion, choosing instead to endure the abuse in silence while documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that evidence would eventually be crucial. "Jessica, I need you to help me with something," Emma said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised both girls. "I need you to help me identify every student who's been affected by Tyler's operation. We're going to need witnesses, and we're going to need documentation of a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond what happened to me yesterday." As they walked toward first period, Emma began to see Riverside High School through new eyes. The dynamics she had previously attributed to typical teenage social hierarchies now revealed themselves as a carefully constructed system of intimidation and control. Football players moved through the hallways with an arrogance that went beyond typical athletic confidence, while honor students kept their heads down and avoided eye contact that might be interpreted as challenging the established order. In her AP biology class, Emma sat next to Sarah Kim, a junior who had been struggling with both academic pressure and what she'd previously described as social difficulties. As Emma settled into her seat, Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of her injuries, and something in her expression suggested that she had her own experiences with Tyler's methods of persuasion. "Emma, what happened to you?" Sarah whispered, glancing nervously around the classroom to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. The fear in her voice was palpable, and Emma realized that Sarah's social difficulties might be more accurately described as systematic harassment. "Tyler Brooks happened to me," Emma replied quietly. "Sarah, has he ever approached you about completing assignments for the football team?" The color drained from Sarah's face, and her hands began to tremble as she gripped her pencil. "You can't ask me about that. If he finds out that I talked to you, he'll make my life even more miserable than it already is. You don't understand what it's like to be trapped in this system." Emma studied her classmates' terrified expression and realized that Tyler's network of intimidation was far more extensive than she had initially understood. Sarah wasn't just another victim. She was a prisoner who had been so thoroughly broken by months of psychological abuse that the thought of resistance seemed impossible. The scope of the problem was becoming clearer with each conversation, and Emma began to understand why her father's military training might be necessary to dismantle such an entrenched system of corruption. During lunch period, Emma and Jessica conducted their own investigation, moving carefully through the cafeteria and identifying students whose academic performance had mysteriously improved despite their obvious lack of engagement with their studies. The pattern was unmistakable. Football players who had previously struggled with basic coursework were suddenly turning in assignments that demonstrated a level of understanding far beyond their capabilities, while honor students appeared increasingly stressed and withdrawn. Marcus Thompson, a senior who had been valedictorian material until this semester, sat alone at a corner table, staring at his untouched sandwich with the hollow expression of someone who had given up hope. When Emma approached him, he initially tried to wave her away, but the sight of her injuries seemed to break through his defensive barriers. "He got to you too," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise. "I've been doing his calculus homework for 3 months. Every time I tried to stop, he'd find new ways to make my life hell. Yesterday, I heard that you'd reported him to Coach Stevens, and I actually felt hope for the first time in weeks. Then I saw you today, and I realized that even the adults can't protect us from him." Emma felt a surge of anger at the defeat in Marcus's voice, but she also recognized an opportunity. "Marcus, what if I told you that my father has a plan?" What if I told you that Tyler's reign of terror is about to end, but we need brave people who are willing to stand up and tell the truth about what's been happening? The change in Marcus's expression was subtle but significant. For the first time in months, she saw a flicker of the determination that had made him one of the school's top students. "What kind of plan?" he asked, leaning forward with interest that hadn't been present moments before. Before Emma could respond, the cafeteria fell silent with the kind of sudden hush that indicated the arrival of someone whose presence commanded immediate attention. Tyler Brooks entered with his usual entourage, scanning the room with the predatory awareness of someone who was accustomed to being feared and respected in equal measure. When his gaze fell on Emma, his smirk widened into something that was meant to be intimidating, but instead filled her with cold resolve. Tyler's approach was deliberate and theatrical, designed to reinforce his dominance in front of the entire student body. He stopped directly in front of Emma's table, his substantial frame casting a shadow over her and Marcus, while Jessica shifted protectively closer to her friend's side. The silence in the cafeteria was so complete that even the kitchen staff had stopped their preparations to observe the confrontation. "Well, well, well," Tyler said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Looks like somebody didn't learn their lesson yesterday. Still running your mouth to people who can't help you?" His eyes shifted to Marcus, who had gone pale, but hadn't moved away from the table. "And recruiting new friends to join your little rebellion, that's not very smart, Emma." Emma stood slowly, her casted wrist held protectively against her chest, but her eyes never leaving Tyler's face. The fear that had controlled her for months was still present, but it was now overshadowed by something far more powerful. The certainty that her father was coming, and that Tyler's days of unchecked intimidation were numbered. "You're right, Tyler," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. "Running my mouth to people who can't help me wasn't very smart. That's why I've decided to talk to people who can." Tyler's smirk faltered slightly, and Emma saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. He was intelligent enough to recognize that something had changed in her demeanor, but not experienced enough to understand what he was seeing. The girl who had cowered before him yesterday had been replaced by someone who seemed almost eager for this confrontation. "You already tried that, remember?" Tyler said, his voice slightly less confident than before. "Coach Stevens wasn't interested in your little story. Nobody in this school is going to choose you over the football team. We're going to regionals, and that's more important than your hurt feelings." Emma smiled, and the expression was so unexpected that several students actually gasped. "You're absolutely right that Coach Stevens wasn't interested in my story. But you know what's funny about having a father who's a teacher? He knows people, important people, people who care more about following the law than they do about high school football." The color began to drain from Tyler's face as the implications of her words sank in. He had operated under the assumption that the school's administrative protection would shield him from any serious consequences, but Emma's calm confidence suggested that the parameters of the situation had fundamentally changed. Around them, students began to lean forward, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "You're bluffing," Tyler said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Your father is just a math teacher. What's he going to do, solve me to death?" Emma's smile widened, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent cafeteria. "My father is a former Marine drill instructor who spent 2 tours teaching young soldiers how to survive in hostile environments. Would you like to know what he taught them about dealing with threats?" The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the distant hum of the school's ventilation system. Tyler's face had gone completely white, and Emma could see him processing the information with the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Around them, students who had lived in fear of his intimidation began to whisper among themselves, and Emma could feel the balance of power in the room beginning to shift. Before Tyler could respond, the cafeteria doors opened with a sharp bang that made everyone jump. Mark Rodriguez entered with the purposeful stride of someone who had a specific objective and would not be deterred from achieving it. He was dressed in his usual teaching attire, but something in his bearing suggested that today he was operating in a different capacity entirely. Behind him walked Officer Martinez, the school resource officer, and a woman in a business suit who Emma didn't recognize, but who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The effect on the cafeteria was immediate and dramatic. Students scrambled to get out of the way as the three adults moved directly toward Tyler's position, and Emma watched her tormentor's face transform from arrogance to panic in the space of a few seconds. Tyler took a step backward, then another, but there was nowhere to retreat in the crowded room. Mark Rodriguez stopped directly in front of Tyler, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had once been responsible for maintaining discipline among combat-trained Marines. "Tyler Brooks, I believe you and I need to have a conversation about the choices you've been making regarding my daughter." Tyler's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The teenager who had terrorized honor students for months was suddenly face-to-face with an adult who understood intimidation as a tactical tool rather than a character flaw. Emma watched the confrontation with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy, understanding that Tyler was about to discover the difference between bullying children and challenging someone who had been trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force. The woman in the business suit stepped forward, her badge clearly visible as she introduced herself. "Tyler Brooks, I'm Detective Sarah Wilson with the Millbrook Police Department. I understand you've been having some difficulties with impulse control and following school policies. We need to discuss several incidents that have been reported to our department." Emma felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched Tyler's world collapse around him. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about justice for every student who had suffered under his reign of terror. Her father had promised her that they would solve this problem systematically, and she was beginning to understand the full scope of his methodology. The interrogation room at Millbrook Police Station was designed to be uncomfortable, with harsh, fluorescent lighting and a metal table that reflected every nervous twitch and bead of sweat. Tyler Brooks sat across from Detective Wilson, his earlier bravado completely evaporated as he faced the reality of criminal charges and the end of his carefully constructed empire of intimidation. His parents flanked him on either side, their faces masks of shock and disappointment as they struggled to comprehend how their son had become the subject of a police investigation. Mark Rodriguez observed from behind the two-way mirror, his trained eye cataloging every micro-expression and gesture that revealed Tyler's psychological state. Years of evaluating recruits under pressure had taught him to recognize when someone's defenses were crumbling, and Tyler Brooks was experiencing a complete collapse of the persona that had allowed him to terrorize students for months without consequence. "Let's start with Emma Rodriguez," Detective Wilson said, her voice professionally neutral as she opened a thick folder containing witness statements and photographic evidence. "Can you tell me about your interaction with her in the gymnasium on Tuesday afternoon?" Tyler's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who specialized in juvenile cases, leaned forward to whisper something in his client's ear. But Tyler shook his head, with the resigned expression of someone who understood that his situation was beyond legal maneuvering. The video evidence that Ryan Mitchell had provided was clear and damning. showing Tyler's deliberate assault on Emma with a level of premeditation that elevated the charges from simple battery to aggravated assault. "I didn't mean to hurt her, and that badly," Tyler mumbled, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning system. She was supposed to keep quiet about the tutoring thing. Coach Stevens said it was normal, that all the successful programs had arrangements like that. Detective Wilson's expression remained impassive, but Mark could see the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated professional disgust. "Tell me about these arrangements, Tyler. How long have they been going on, and who else was involved?" The floodgates opened with Tyler's response, revealing a system of academic corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. For over 2 years, Coach Stevens had been facilitating a network where honor students completed assignments for football players in exchange for protection from harassment and favorable treatment from certain faculty members. The operation had grown increasingly sophisticated, with students like Marcus Thompson essentially functioning as unpaid academic consultants while living in constant fear of retribution if they attempted to withdraw their cooperation. Meanwhile, back at Riverside High School, the news of Tyler's arrest had spread through the student body like wildfire, creating a mixture of relief and anxiety as teenagers processed the implications of the power shift they were witnessing. Emma found herself at the center of attention in a way that felt both empowering and overwhelming, as students who had previously avoided her out of fear now approached with expressions of gratitude and support. Coach Stevens had barricaded himself in his office, refusing to take calls from the media or meet with school administrators who were desperately trying to contain the scandal before it destroyed the football program's championship aspirations. The regional playoffs were less than 2 weeks away, and the revelation that their star quarterback was facing felony charges threatened to unravel everything Stevens had built during his tenure at Riverside High. Principal Davis convened an emergency meeting with the district superintendent, desperately searching for a way to minimize the damage to the school's reputation while protecting the administrative careers that hung in the balance. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as lawyers and public relations specialists attempted to craft a response that would satisfy the growing media attention without admitting institutional liability for the systematic abuse that had flourished under their watch. "We need to frame this as an isolated incident," suggested the district's communications director, a polished woman who specialized in crisis management. "One troubled student who acted without the knowledge or approval of the coaching staff or administration. We distance ourselves from Tyler Brooks while emphasizing our commitment to student safety and academic integrity." Superintendent Johnson, a man whose political ambitions extended far beyond the education system, nodded thoughtfully as he considered the implications. "What about the Rodriguez family? Are they amenable to a quiet settlement that keeps this out of the courts?" The question hung in the air like toxic smoke, revealing the administration's primary concern with protecting institutional interests rather than addressing the systematic failures that had enabled Tyler's reign of terror. Unknown to them, Mark Rodriguez had anticipated exactly this response and had spent the morning working with Detective Wilson to ensure that any attempt at institutional cover-up would face immediate legal consequences. Emma sat in the school counselor's office, finally having the opportunity to tell her complete story to someone who was required by law to take action. Dr. Sarah Wilson had been brought in from the district office specifically to handle the crisis, and her credentials in trauma counseling made her uniquely qualified to understand the psychological impact of sustained intimidation on academic performance and social development. "Emma, I want you to understand that what you've experienced constitutes a pattern of harassment that should never have been allowed to continue," Dr. Wilson said, her voice gentle but firm. The fact that your initial attempts to seek help were dismissed represents a serious failure of our duty to provide a safe learning environment. The validation felt like a physical weight lifting from Emma's shoulders. For months, she had internalized the message that her experiences were somehow normal or acceptable, that standing up for herself was somehow inappropriate or disruptive to the school's culture. Having a professional acknowledge the severity of what she had endured helped her process the trauma while reinforcing her decision to fight back against the system that had failed her. Dr. Wilson continued taking notes as Emma described the elaborate network of academic extortion that Tyler had constructed with apparent administrative approval. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of institutional corruption that extended beyond individual misconduct into systematic abuse of power, designed to prioritize athletic success over student welfare and academic integrity. "I need to ask you about other students who may have been affected," Dr. Wilson said carefully. "Your testimony suggests that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of coercion. Are there classmates who might be willing to come forward if they felt safe doing so?" Emma nodded, thinking of Marcus Thompson's defeated expression and Sarah Kim's terrified response to any mention of Tyler's name. "There are dozens of them, Dr. Wilson. Honor students who've been forced to complete assignments for football players, kids who've been threatened with physical violence if they don't cooperate, and teachers who've been pressured to inflate grades to maintain athletic eligibility." The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving not just student-on-student violence, but faculty participation in academic fraud that could trigger state education department investigations and federal oversight. Dr. Wilson realized that Emma's case was merely the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink careers and destroy the reputations of everyone involved in maintaining the conspiracy of silence. As word of the investigation spread beyond the school grounds, local media outlets began arriving at Riverside High, their satellite trucks and camera crews creating a circus atmosphere that made normal educational activities impossible. Students gathered in clusters around the windows, watching reporters interview parents and community members about their knowledge of the football program's academic practices. Mark Rodriguez had anticipated the media attention and had spent considerable time preparing Emma for the scrutiny that would inevitably follow her decision to speak out. His military experience had taught him the importance of controlling information flow during crisis situations, and he understood that public opinion would play a crucial role in determining whether the institutional changes he sought would actually be implemented. "Emma, you need to understand that some people are going to try to make you the villain in this story," Mark explained as they sat in their living room watching the evening news coverage of Tyler's arrest. "They're going to say that you're destroying a young man's future over a minor disagreement, or that you're hurting the school's athletic program out of jealousy or spite." Emma absorbed her father's warning with the analytical mindset he had, taught her to apply to complex problems. "But Dad, we have evidence, we have witnesses, we have documentation of systematic abuse that went on for years. How can they possibly spin that into my fault?" Mark's expression grew grim as he considered the political realities they were facing. "Sweetheart, you're underestimating people's capacity to rationalize injustice when it serves their interests. This football team was supposed to bring glory to Millbrook, and there are adults whose careers and egos are tied up in that success. They're going to fight dirty to protect what they've built." The prediction proved accurate within hours as social media platforms erupted with conflicting narratives about Emma's motivations and the legitimacy of her complaints. Supporters praised her courage in speaking out against institutional bullying, while critics suggested that she was an attention-seeking troublemaker who was destroying innocent lives out of personal vendetta. The divide in public opinion reflected deeper tensions within the Millbrook community about the proper role of athletics in education and the acceptable costs of competitive success. Parents who had invested years in supporting the football program found themselves torn between their loyalty to the team and their growing awareness of the abuse that had been perpetrated in the name of victory. Coach Stevens finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation to hold a press conference outside the school, surrounded by lawyers and flanked by several football parents who had organized to defend the program. His statement was carefully crafted to acknowledge regret about Tyler's actions while denying any knowledge of systematic misconduct or institutional approval for academic fraud. Tyler Brooks made some poor choices, and I'm deeply sorry that any student was hurt as a result, Stevens said, reading from prepared remarks while avoiding eye contact with the cameras. However, I want to be absolutely clear that the coaching staff and administration had no knowledge of any inappropriate arrangements regarding academic assistance. We've always encouraged our student athletes to seek help with their studies through proper channels. The statement was technically accurate while being fundamentally dishonest, a careful parsing of language designed to create legal distance between Stevens and Tyler's operation while maintaining plausible deniability about the systematic nature of the abuse. Mark Rodriguez watched the press conference with the cold analysis of someone who recognized sophisticated deception when he encountered it. Detective Wilson had anticipated Stevens' response and had spent the day interviewing students and faculty, members who could provide evidence of administrative knowledge and approval for the academic extortion network. The investigation was revealing a paper trail of emails and meeting notes that contradicted Stevens' claims of ignorance while demonstrating active participation in maintaining the conspiracy of silence. Ryan Mitchell proved to be a crucial witness, having maintained detailed records of his interactions with both Tyler and Coach Stevens over the course of 2 academic years. His computer science background had led him to document conversations and preserve electronic communications in ways that provided clear evidence of institutional involvement in the corruption. "I saved everything," Ryan explained to Detective Wilson during his interview. "Screenshots of text messages, recordings of phone calls, copies of assignments I was forced to complete. I knew that someday someone would need proof of what was really happening, and I wanted to be ready." The digital evidence was devastating, revealing not just Tyler's individual misconduct, but a systematic pattern of administrative protection and faculty participation that extended throughout the athletic department. Email chains showed coaches discussing which teachers would be most amenable to grade inflation, while text messages revealed explicit threats made against students who showed reluctance to participate in the academic fraud. Emma spent the evening reviewing her own experiences in light of the evidence that was emerging from other witnesses, beginning to understand that her individual trauma was part of a much larger pattern of institutional abuse. The realization was both validating and overwhelming, confirming that her decision to speak out was justified while revealing the full scope of the corruption she was challenging. Her father found her in her room, staring at the cast on her wrist, while processing the weight of everything that was unfolding around her. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk with the gentle concern of a parent who understood the psychological toll of fighting against entrenched power structures. "I keep thinking about all the students who suffered before me," Emma said quietly. "How many kids were too scared to speak up? How many gave up and just accepted that this was normal? If I hadn't had you to support me, would I have been strong enough to fight back?" Mark considered her questions with the serious attention they deserved, understanding that Emma was grappling with complex issues of individual responsibility and systemic oppression that would shape her worldview for years to come. "What you It took extraordinary courage, Emma. But you're right that not every student has the resources or support system to challenge this kind of abuse. That's exactly why what you did was so important, and why we can't stop until we've exposed everyone who was involved in maintaining this system. The Millbrook Community Center had never hosted an event quite like the emergency school board meeting that convened on Thursday evening. Every seat in the main auditorium was occupied, with overflow crowds spilling into the adjacent hallways as concerned parents, students, and community members gathered to demand accountability for the systematic abuse that had been exposed at Riverside High School. Television crews from 3 different stations had set up equipment along the walls, their cameras capturing the raw emotion and barely contained fury that permeated the packed venue. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, flanked by her parents and Jessica Chen, her casted wrist serving as a visible reminder of the violence that had sparked the investigation. Behind her, a growing coalition of students and families affected by Tyler's network had organized themselves into a unified voice demanding justice and institutional reform. Marcus Thompson sat with his parents, his academic transcripts and documentation of forced labor spread across his lap like evidence. In a trial, Sarah Kim had finally found the courage to attend, her mother's protective arm around her shoulders as she prepared to publicly describe months of psychological torment. The 5-member school board filed onto the stage with the grim expressions of politicians facing a career-ending scandal. Board President Jennifer Walsh had spent the past 3 days consulting with lawyers and crisis management specialists, searching for a strategy that might preserve both the district's reputation and the board members' political futures. The regional championship game was scheduled for the following weekend, and the pressure to minimize disruption to the football program remained intense despite the mounting evidence of corruption. Superintendent Johnson approached the podium with carefully prepared remarks designed to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation while limiting institutional liability. His political background had taught him the importance of controlling narrative flow during crisis situations, but the evidence compiled by Detective Wilson and Mark Rodriguez had made traditional damage control strategies ineffective. We are here tonight to address serious allegations regarding inappropriate conduct within our athletic program, Johnson began, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. While we cannot comment on ongoing criminal investigations, I want to assure this community that the district takes these matters with the utmost seriousness and will implement whatever changes are necessary to ensure student safety. The response from the audience was immediate and hostile, with angry voices demanding specific answers about administrative knowledge and accountability for the systematic failures that had enabled Tyler's reign of terror. Parents who had trusted the school system to protect their children were learning that their faith had been misplaced, and their fury was directed not just at individual perpetrators, but at the institutional culture that had prioritized athletic success over student welfare. Mark Rodriguez rose from his seat with the measured confidence of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this moment. His military bearing commanded immediate attention, and the auditorium fell silent as he approached the microphone designated for public comments. In his hands, he carried a thick folder containing evidence that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the meeting and potentially destroy several careers. My name is Mark Rodriguez, and my daughter Emma was assaulted by Tyler Brooks in your school gymnasium while your administration looked the other way, Mark began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. What I'm about to share with you tonight will demonstrate that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the predictable result of a systematic culture of intimidation and corruption that has infected every level of your athletic program. The first document Mark presented was a series of email communications between Coach Stevens and several faculty members, discussing strategies for maintaining academic eligibility for football players whose grades didn't meet district standards. The messages revealed explicit knowledge of the academic fraud network, including specific instructions for pressuring honor students to provide unauthorized assistance with assignments and examinations. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Mark methodically presented evidence that contradicted every public statement they had made about the scope of administrative knowledge. Emailed timestamps showed that Principal Davis had been copied on messages discussing the tutoring arrangements, while budget documents revealed suspicious payments to several students who had been identified as Tyler's primary victims. The evidence shows that this corruption extends beyond individual misconduct into systematic institutional failure. Mark continued, his voice growing more intense as he detailed the scope of the conspiracy. Your coaching staff didn't just enable Tyler Brooks, they created the environment that made his abuse inevitable. Your administration didn't just ignore warning signs, they actively participated in maintaining a system designed to protect athletic interests at the expense of student safety. Emma watched her father's presentation with a mixture of pride and amazement, understanding for the first time the full extent of his investigation and the military precision with which he had documented every aspect of the corruption. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of institutional rot that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. The revelation that rocked the auditorium came when Mark presented financial records showing irregular payments from the athletic department's budget to a private tutoring service that had never actually provided any legitimate educational services. The company existed solely as a front for laundering money that was then distributed to students who had been coerced into completing assignments for football players. Ladies and gentlemen, your tax dollars were used to fund a criminal enterprise, Mark announced, his words causing an eruption of angry voices throughout the auditorium. The same budget that claimed insufficient funds for updated textbooks and laboratory equipment was somehow able to finance a systematic program of academic fraud and student intimidation. Board President Walsh called for order as the crowd's anger reached a crescendo, but her authority had been fundamentally undermined by the evidence of institutional complicity in the corruption. Parents who had supported tax increases and bond measures to fund school improvements were learning that their money had been diverted to protect a football program built on academic fraud and student abuse. Detective Wilson rose from her seat in the audience, her badge clearly visible as she approached the microphone. The criminal investigation had reached a point where public disclosure was not only appropriate, but necessary to ensure community safety and prevent evidence tampering. Her presence added an official dimension to the proceedings that made continued denial impossible for the school board. Based on our investigation, the Millbrook Police Department has identified at least 15 students who were systematically coerced into providing academic assistance to football players over a period of 2 years, Detective Wilson announced. We have documented evidence of threats, physical intimidation, and financial fraud involving district resources. Criminal charges are pending against multiple individuals, including district employees who facilitated this operation. The implications were staggering, extending beyond individual criminal liability into federal education law violations that could trigger state intervention and potentially result in the loss of accreditation for the entire district. The community was beginning to understand that the corruption at Riverside High School represented more than a local scandal. It was a case study in institutional failure that would have consequences lasting far beyond the current academic year. Emma finally stood to address the board, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering as she faced the administrators who had failed to protect her and countless other students. The auditorium fell completely silent as the teenage girl who had suffered the most visible consequences of the corruption prepared to confront those responsible for enabling it. "I want to read you something," Emma said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "This is a text message that Tyler Brooks sent me 2 weeks before he assaulted me. He wrote, 'Your dad can't protect you here. This is our house, and you play by our rules or you get hurt.' When I showed this to Principal Davis, he told me that teenage drama wasn't his responsibility and that I should focus on my studies instead of causing trouble. The revelation that Principal Davis had been directly informed about specific threats against Emma weeks before the assault sent shockwaves through the auditorium. Parents realized that the attack could have been prevented if administrators had taken appropriate action, while board members began to understand that their liability extended beyond negligent supervision into willful indifference to student safety. Emma continued her statement with growing confidence, describing the psychological impact of months of intimidation and the academic pressure of being forced to complete assignments for students who had no interest in learning. Her words painted a vivid picture of the hostile environment that had been allowed to flourish at Riverside High School, while her visible injuries served as physical evidence of the violence that had resulted from administrative inaction. "I'm not here tonight asking for sympathy," Emma concluded. "I'm here demanding that you acknowledge the systematic failures that enabled Tyler Brooks and ensure that no other student has to endure what I experienced. This isn't about destroying a football program. It's about creating a school environment where education takes priority over athletics and where student safety is more important than championship trophies." The standing ovation that followed Emma's statement was thunderous and sustained, with community members expressing their support for her courage while directing their fury at the administrators who had failed in their fundamental duty to protect students. Several board members appeared visibly shaken by the evidence they had heard, while others maintained the defensive posture of politicians hoping to survive a scandal. Coach Stevens finally appeared at the meeting, accompanied by a team of lawyers, who had advised him to make a public statement addressing the allegations. His appearance created a buzz of anticipation throughout the auditorium as community members prepared to hear his explanation for the systematic abuse that had occurred. Under his supervision, "I want to apologize to Emma Rodriguez and her family for the pain they have suffered," Stevens began, reading from prepared remarks while avoiding eye contact with the audience. "Tyler Brooks' actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for failing to recognize the warning signs that might have prevented this incident." The carefully crafted non-apology was immediately challenged by parents who demanded specific answers about his knowledge of the academic fraud network and his role in creating the culture that had enabled Tyler's abuse. Stevens' lawyers attempted to limit his responses to avoid self-incrimination, but the pressure from the audience made evasive answers impossible. Mark Rodriguez stood again, this time with a different folder containing evidence that would prove definitively that Stevens had not only known about the corruption, but had actively participated in its planning and implementation. The documents included handwritten notes from coaching meetings where strategies for academic fraud were discussed, along with budget requests specifically designed to fund the illegal tutoring operation. Coach Stevens, would you like to explain this memo dated 6 months ago where you wrote, "Thompson and Kim are refusing to cooperate with our academic support program. Recommend increased pressure through Brooks and social isolation protocols?" Mark asked, his voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade. The question hung in the air like an indictment, revealing not just knowledge of the abuse, but active planning and implementation of psychological torture designed to maintain academic fraud. Stephen's lawyers immediately moved to prevent further questioning, but the damage had been done. The community had heard enough to understand that the corruption extended to the highest levels of the athletic program. The meeting continued past midnight as witness after witness came forward to describe their experiences with the systematic abuse that had flourished at Riverside High School. Teachers testified about pressure to inflate grades, while students detailed months of psychological torture designed to maintain their cooperation with academic fraud. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, involving dozens of participants in a conspiracy that had poisoned the entire educational environment. When the school board finally called for a vote on emergency measures, the outcome was predetermined by the weight of evidence and community pressure. Coach Stevens was immediately terminated, pending criminal charges, while Principal Davis was placed on administrative leave during a comprehensive investigation. The football program was suspended indefinitely, ending championship hopes while signaling a fundamental shift in district priorities. Emma watched the votes being tallied with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion, understanding that justice was finally being served while recognizing that the work of rebuilding trust and institutional integrity was only beginning. Her father's military precision had exposed the corruption, but creating lasting change would require sustained community engagement and vigilant oversight. 6 months after the explosive school board meeting that dismantled the corruption at Riverside High School, Emma Rodriguez walked through hallways that felt transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The oppressive atmosphere of fear that had once permeated every corner of the building had been replaced by something Emma had never experienced before: genuine educational focus. Students moved with confidence rather than anxiety, engaging in conversations about academic projects and extracurricular activities without constantly scanning for potential threats. The physical changes were immediately apparent to anyone who had known the school during Stephen's reign. The trophy cases that had once dominated the main entrance, filled exclusively with football achievements, now displayed awards from academic competitions, debate tournaments, and arts festivals. The morning announcements celebrated students who had earned college scholarships based on merit rather than athletic ability, while bulletin boards showcased research projects and creative works that demonstrated genuine intellectual engagement. Tyler Brooks had pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was serving his sentence at a juvenile detention facility where he was required to complete his education under strict supervision while participating in counseling programs designed to address his violent behavior. His early release was contingent upon demonstrating genuine remorse and completing community service focused on anti-bullying education. The legal consequences had been severe enough to send a clear message that student-on-student violence would not be tolerated, regardless of athletic status or social connections. Coach Stevens faced federal charges for his role in the academic fraud scheme, with prosecutors building a case that could result in significant prison time and permanent disqualification from working in educational settings. The investigation had revealed that similar corruption existed in other districts where he had previously worked, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had destroyed educational environments across multiple communities. His downfall had become a cautionary tale discussed in education law courses and administrative training programs throughout the state. The new football coach, Maria Santos, was a former Marine Corps officer who had transitioned into education after completing her military service. Her hiring had been Mark Rodriguez's suggestion, based on his belief that military discipline and educational integrity were not mutually exclusive concepts. Under her leadership, The revived football program emphasized academic performance as a prerequisite for participation, with regular grade checks and mandatory study sessions that actually focused on learning rather than fraud. Emma had become something of a celebrity within educational reform circles, receiving invitations to speak at conferences and workshops focused on combating institutional bullying and academic corruption. Her story had been featured in national publications as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systematic change, inspiring students in other districts to report abuse that had previously been accepted as normal. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but Emma had learned to view her platform as an opportunity to prevent other students from experiencing the trauma she had endured. The Rodriguez family had received a substantial settlement from the school district, money that would ensure Emma's college education while providing resources for her continued advocacy work. More importantly, the legal victory had established precedents that strengthened student rights and increased institutional accountability in districts across the country. Civil rights organizations now cited the Rodriguez case as a model for how families could effectively challenge systematic abuse in educational settings. Mark Rodriguez had been promoted to department head for mathematics, a position that allowed him to implement teaching methodologies that prioritized genuine understanding over grade inflation. His military background had proven invaluable in creating structured learning environments where students felt safe to struggle with difficult concepts without fear of retribution. The transformation of the mathematics department had become a case study in how institutional culture could be rebuilt from the ground up. Jessica Chen had co-founded a student advocacy organization called Safe Schools Initiative that worked to identify and address bullying before it escalated into systematic abuse. The group had established anonymous reporting systems and peer support networks that empowered students to speak out against intimidation while providing resources for those who had been victimized. Their model had been adopted by dozens of other schools, creating a grassroots movement focused on preventing the kind of institutional failure that had nearly destroyed Emma's educational experience. The state education department had implemented new oversight protocols specifically designed to prevent the kind of academic fraud that had flourished at Riverside High School. Regular audits now examined the relationship between athletic performance and academic achievement, while whistleblower protections ensured that students and faculty could report corruption without fear of retaliation. The Rodriguez case had forced policymakers to acknowledge that competitive pressure in high school athletics could create environments where abuse became normalized and systematic. Dr. Sarah Wilson had been hired as the permanent principal at Riverside High School, bringing expertise in trauma-informed education and restorative justice practices. Her approach emphasized healing and prevention rather than punishment and control, creating an environment where students felt comfortable discussing their struggles without fear of judgment or retribution. The transformation under her leadership had been so dramatic that Riverside had become a model for other districts seeking to reform their disciplinary practices. Emma's physical injuries had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how far she had come, rather than symbols of victimization. Her hair had grown back stronger than before, and she wore it with pride as a symbol of resilience rather than shame. The cast had been removed months earlier, but the strength she had discovered during those weeks of healing had become a permanent part of her character. The academic fraud network had been completely dismantled, with new policies requiring multiple forms of verification for all assignments and examinations. Honor students no longer lived in fear of being coerced into completing work for athletes, while teachers felt empowered to maintain academic standards without pressure from coaching staff. The The culture of learning that emerged from the reforms had actually improved the school's overall academic performance, demonstrating that integrity and excellence were complementary rather than competing values. Marcus Thompson had recovered his academic confidence and was preparing for early admission to several prestigious universities, his transcript reflecting genuine achievement rather than the stress-induced decline that had characterized his junior year. He had become one of Emma's closest allies in the advocacy work, using his experience to help other students who had been trapped in similar situations. His transformation from defeated victim to empowered advocate illustrated the broader healing that was taking place throughout the school community. Sarah Kim had blossomed under the new environment, discovering talents and interests that had been suppressed during the years of intimidation. She had joined the debate team and started a creative writing club, activities that would have been impossible when she lived in constant fear of Tyler's retaliation. Her parents had become active supporters of the school reforms, understanding that their daughter's academic success was directly linked to her emotional safety and psychological well-being. Ryan Mitchell's computer skills had been channeled into creating digital platforms for student advocacy and peer support, technological solutions that helped prevent isolation and provided resources for those experiencing bullying or harassment. His documentation of the academic fraud had become a template for other students seeking to expose systematic abuse, demonstrating how technology could be used to create accountability and transparency in educational settings. The ripple effects of Emma's courage extended far beyond Millbrook, inspiring legislative changes that strengthened student protection laws and increased penalties for educational corruption. Her story had become required reading in teacher preparation, the programs ensuring that future educators understood their legal and ethical obligations to protect students from institutional abuse. The case had also influenced federal education policy, leading to increased funding for anti-bullying programs and mandatory training for administrators. Emma often reflected on how different her life might have been if she had remained silent about Tyler's abuse, accepting the toxic environment as normal rather than fighting for change. The transformation of Riverside High School had required tremendous effort and sacrifice, but the results exceeded anything she had imagined possible. Students who had never known life without systematic intimidation were discovering their potential. In an environment that prioritized learning over athletic achievement, the former culture of fear had been replaced by something Emma had never experienced before: genuine school spirit based on academic achievement and community support rather than athletic dominance and social intimidation. School events celebrated intellectual accomplishments and artistic achievements, while sports programs focused on developing character and teamwork rather than maintaining eligibility through fraud. As Emma prepared for her senior year, she looked forward to experiencing a normal high school environment for the first time in her academic career. The college acceptance letters that had begun arriving reflected genuine academic achievement rather than inflated grades, and her future plans included continued advocacy work alongside her studies in education policy and law. The trauma that had once threatened to define her had instead become the foundation for a life dedicated to protecting other students from similar experiences. The legacy of her fight against institutional corruption would outlast her high school years, creating lasting changes that would protect future generations of students from the systematic abuse that had once been considered normal at Riverside High School. Her father's military training had provided the strategic framework for exposing the corruption, but Emma's courage in speaking out had been the catalyst that made genuine reform possible. Standing in the hallway where she had once walked in fear, Emma understood that her story represented more than individual triumph over adversity. It demonstrated how systematic change was possible when individuals refused to accept injustice as inevitable, and how institutional corruption could be dismantled through persistence, evidence, and community support. The Rodriguez name would be remembered not as victims of abuse, but as the family that refused to let corruption flourish in the shadows. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.